I could barely walk when I stepped off the Army shuttle. By sunset, my husband had called me a burden. My mother-in-law had forced my 10-year-old daughter and me out of their house, and I was driving through a Kentucky thunderstorm, wondering how my entire life had fallen apart in less than 12 hours. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 46 years old, and I served in the U.S. Army for 22 years as a logistics officer. I wasn't a hero, and I wasn't extraordinary. I simply believed that when your country asked you to do a job, you gave it your best. My final deployment was in Kuwait. 3 months before returning home, a military transport truck slid off a flooded road during a supply mission. We all survived, but my left leg was never the same afterward. The doctors repaired what they could, but nerve damage isn't something that disappears overnight. The Army told me I would likely walk with a limp for the rest of my life. I accepted that. What I never expected was that my own family wouldn't. Brian barely looked away from his phone when I walked through the front door of our house in Lexington. "You're home," he said. There was no hug, no smile, just those two words. Before I could set down my duffel bag, Emma came running toward me. "Mom!" She wrapped her arms gently around my waist, almost as if someone had already warned her not to hug me too tightly. I kissed the top of her head. "I missed you more than you know." "I made you a welcome home sign," she whispered. She pointed toward the dining room, where colorful construction paper hung unevenly across the wall. "Welcome home, Mom." Some of the letters were backward. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in over a year. Linda Dawson sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee as though she owned the house. Technically, she didn't, but she certainly acted like she did. She looked me over from head to toe. "So, this is how you came back?" I forced a smile. "The doctors say I'll continue improving." She simply shrugged. "I guess we'll see." That evening felt unusually quiet. Brian barely said a word during dinner. Emma kept trying to fill the silence by talking about school, her soccer team, and the stray cat she'd been feeding behind the garage. Every time she laughed, Brian looked annoyed. After Emma went upstairs to take a shower, Brian finally spoke. "We need to be honest with each other." I recognized that tone. I'd heard soldiers use it before delivering difficult news. "What is it?" He rubbed his forehead. "I didn't expect things to be like this." I looked down at my leg. "You mean because I'm limping?" "I mean everything." He stood up and walked toward the window. "I've been thinking about this for months." My stomach tightened. "I don't think I can do this anymore." "Do what?" "This marriage." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "I spent a year wondering if I'd ever make it home," I said quietly, "and I spent a year realizing I don't want to spend the rest of my life taking care of someone." I stared at him. "I don't need anyone to take care of me." "You say that now." Before I could respond, Linda walked into the room carrying my suitcase. She placed it beside the front door without any care. "I'm sorry, Claire," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. "Brian deserves a chance to be happy." I looked from her to my husband. Neither of them looked away. At that moment, Emma came downstairs. She froze. "Mom?" Brian wouldn't even look at his own daughter. I carefully knelt down and hugged her. "We're going for a little drive in the rain." She nodded without asking another question. Children often understand more than adults realize. 20 minutes later, the windshield wipers struggled against the heavy rain as we left Lexington behind. I didn't have a real destination in mind. There was only one place left to go. My childhood home. The old farmhouse my father had left behind. For years I'd planned to sell it someday. I had no idea that by sunrise, that house would completely change the way I looked at both my past and my future. The rain never stopped. It hammered against my old Ford Explorer so hard that the headlights barely cut through the darkness. Interstate 64 was nearly empty, except for the occasional semi-truck sending sheets of water across my windshield. Emma fell asleep about an hour outside Lexington. She still had her small pink backpack on her shoulders. She must have grabbed it before we left. I glanced at her and smiled, despite everything. Children always seem to pack the things that matter most. Inside her backpack was the stuffed rabbit she'd loved since kindergarten, the chapter book she was halfway through reading, and, if I knew my daughter, at least 3 snack bars she had hidden from her father. I wished life could always stay that simple. The farther east I drove, the more familiar everything became. Old gas stations, small churches with white steeples, feed stores, country roads I hadn't traveled since I was in my 20s. I never planned to come back here. After my father passed away nearly 18 years earlier, I couldn't bear looking at the farmhouse. Every room reminded me of him. Every fence post held a memory. So I locked the doors, paid the property taxes every year, and kept telling myself I'd deal with it someday. It seemed that someday had finally arrived. Around 1:30 in the morning, I turned onto Miller Creek Road. The narrow blacktop gave way to gravel. The tires crunched beneath the truck. Even through the rain, I recognized every curve. There was the old grain silo that had leaned to one side for as long as I could remember. The abandoned red barn where my friends and I used to play hide and seek. The small cemetery where my grandparents rested beneath matching limestone headstones. When the farmhouse finally came into view, my chest tightened. The porch light was on. I frowned. That made no sense. No one had lived there for years. I parked beneath the giant maple tree my dad had planted when I was in middle school. The rain eased into a steady drizzle. Before I could open the driver's door, someone stepped onto the porch. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane. Even from a distance, I recognized him. Walter, he smiled. I was wondering how long it would take you. Walter Jenkins looked much older than I remembered. He had to be in his 80s by now. His white hair had grown thinner and his shoulders bent forward with age. But his smile hadn't changed at all. I stepped out carefully. My leg protested immediately. Walter noticed. "So it finally caught up with you." I gave a quiet laugh. "I guess it did." He looked toward Emma, still asleep inside the SUV. "That's your little girl, Emma. She's beautiful." Then he reached into the pocket of his old canvas jacket. "I've been waiting a long time to give you something." He pulled out a large manila envelope. It looked very old. The edges had become soft with age, and dust still clung to the corners despite the plastic sleeve protecting it. Across the front, written in neat block letters, were only 4 words. "For Claire when she comes home." My heart skipped. I recognized the handwriting. "Dad." Walter nodded. "He left it with me." My throat tightened. "When?" "The week before he passed." I stared at him. "He knew I was coming tonight?" Walter slowly shook his head. "No." "Then why?" He looked toward the farmhouse. "He didn't know when. He only said that one day life would bring you back here." Rain continued dripping from the porch roof. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. "Why didn't you mail it?" Walter gave me a sad smile. "Because Frank made me promise. He said if I mailed it, you'd rate it." Walter looked directly into my eyes. "But if I handed it to you here?" He glanced at the old farmhouse. "You'd understand it." I looked at the house. Its white paint had faded with time. The porch swing my father built still hung exactly where he left it. The wind chime my mother bought before she passed away still moved gently in the breeze. For the first time since leaving Lexington, I felt something besides heartbreak. I felt curiosity. Walter rested one weathered hand on my shoulder. "Get Emma inside. Both of you need a warm meal." Then he quietly added, "After that, you can find out why your father spent the last year of his life writing almost every single day." I looked down at the envelope again. It suddenly felt much heavier than paper ever should. Walter insisted that Emma and I come inside before opening it. "The furnace still works," he said. "It's not pretty, but it does the job." The farmhouse smelled exactly as I remembered. Old pine floors, fresh coffee, and a hint of cedar from the closet near the front door. The furniture had barely changed. Dad's recliner still faced the stone fireplace. His reading glasses rested on the small table beside it, as though he had only stepped outside for a few minutes. For a brief moment, I forgot he had been gone for 18 years. Emma quietly walked through the living room. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Did Grandpa live here all by himself?" "He did." She gently ran her fingers across the old piano. "I wish I had met him." "So do I." Walter disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later carrying bowls of homemade chicken soup. "Eat first," he said. "Some things are easier to hear on a full stomach." Neither Emma nor I argued. By the time we finished eating, the rain outside the kitchen window had slowed to a light drizzle. Walter slowly pushed the envelope across the table. "I think it's time." My hands paused before I touched it. The paper felt fragile from age. Carefully, I pulled out a folded letter. There were only 2 pages. At the top, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words. My dear Claire, if you're reading this. For a moment, I stopped breathing. Walter quietly turned toward the window, giving me the privacy to read. I unfolded the second page. If life has brought you back to this house, then something has gone terribly wrong. A tear rolled down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. Dad knew me too well. The letter continued. You have always believed people deserve another chance. That was something I admired about you. But there is one man I never fully trusted. Before I reached the name, I already knew who he meant. Brian. I looked up at Walter. You knew? He nodded slowly. Your father told me. I lowered my eyes to the letter again. A year before your wedding, Brian came here while you were away at training. I frowned. Brian had never mentioned that visit. He asked questions no young man in love should have been asking. He wanted to know who owned this farm, how much land came with it. He asked about my savings, my life insurance, and whether everything would belong to you one day. My stomach turned. Dad had written down every question exactly as Brian asked it. The date was neatly written in the corner of the page. Nearly 20 years ago, long before Brian proposed, long before Emma was born, long before I had any reason to question him. The next paragraph was even harder to read. I prayed I was wrong. I hoped he was simply young and immature. People grow, people change. For your sake, I wanted to believe he would. I closed my eyes. Dad had never spoken badly about Brian, not once. Even when I assumed they simply didn't have much in common. He had carried those concerns alone all those years. The letter continued. If you're reading this, then my fears were probably justified. Please don't waste your time wondering whether you caused any of this. Some people only love what they believe they can gain. When there's nothing left to take, they leave. Emma quietly reached over and held my hand. Mom, I'm okay. It wasn't true, but I needed her to believe it. Near the bottom of the page, Dad had written something completely unexpected. There's something else you need to know. My eyes moved quickly across the words. Several months after Brian's visit, I hired attorney Harold Benson in Winchester. He created a trust in your name. The farmhouse, the surrounding land, the mineral rights, every investment account, everything is protected. I stared at the page. What trust? Walter smiled gently. You really didn't know? I slowly shook my head. Dad had never mentioned any of it. Walter walked over to another box sitting beside the fireplace. It was old and made of wood. The brass hinges had turned green with age. He carried it to the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of black notebooks. Every one of them was labeled by year. Frank Miller journals. Walter looked at me quietly. Claire, your father wrote almost every day. I stared at the stack. There had to be nearly 20 years of his thoughts inside that box. Somehow, I already knew the letter had revealed only a small part of the story. I didn't sleep that night. Emma curled up on the old couch beneath one of my mother's handmade quilts and fell asleep almost immediately. Children have an incredible ability to find peace in places where adults only remember pain. I envied her. The farmhouse remained silent, except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every hour it chimed, reminding me how much of my life had passed without me seeing what had been right in front of me. Walter left shortly after midnight. Before walking out, he rested one hand on the wooden box filled with journals. Don't rush through them, he said. Your father wasn't writing history. He was writing to you. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I carried the first notebook into the kitchen. The cover read, 2025, the year before Brian and I got married. I poured myself a cup of coffee, knowing I wasn't going to sleep anyway. Dad's handwriting filled every page. Some entries were simple. Changed the oil in the tractor today. Fence needs repairs before winter. Claire called from Texas. She sounds happy. Those ordinary notes made me smile. Then I reached an entry dated October 17th. Dad had underlined the date. Brian stopped by today. My stomach tightened. I've been expecting you. I laughed quietly. That seems to be a common phrase around here. He chuckled. Your father planned further ahead than almost anyone I've ever known. For nearly 2 hours, Harold explained every detail of the trust. Dad had never been wealthy by Lexington standards, but he had always been careful with money. He invested steadily, stayed away from risky opportunities, and never borrowed unless it was absolutely necessary. The farm, with its 38 acres, the mineral rights, a modest investment portfolio, and the life insurance policy he had never touched after Mom passed away, altogether were worth far more than I had ever imagined. I sat there speechless. I had no idea. Harold nodded. He wanted it that way. Why? Because he believed inheritance changes people. I thought about Brian. Maybe Dad had been right all along. Harold slid another folder across the desk. There's one more thing you should know. I opened it. Inside were copies of several legal documents. One signature caught my attention immediately. Brian's. He signed these about 15 years ago. I looked at Harold. I don't understand. When your father refinanced a small section of the property, Brian signed a legal acknowledgement confirming that he understood this estate belonged solely to you. I blinked. He knew? He absolutely knew. I leaned back in my chair, so Brian hadn't simply guessed that I might inherit the farm one day. He had known for years, and after every deployment, he still looked me in the eye and acted as though money had never mattered. When I stepped outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. For the first time since coming home, I realized something important. Brian had taken my house. He had taken my marriage. He had emptied my savings. He had damaged my confidence. But thanks to my father, he hadn't taken my future. That evening, Walter found me sitting on the porch with a hammer in one hand and a loose porch board at my feet. You planning to fix that yourself? I can try, Walter grinned. Claire, I've known you since you were 8 years old. You inherited Frank's stubbornness. I did. He laughed. Good. You're going to need every bit of it. I smiled for the first time in several days. Somehow, hearing those words from an old family friend meant more than any speech about staying strong ever could. The next morning, I decided to begin repairing the porch one board at a time. It felt like the right place to start. Just as I would rebuild the porch piece by piece, I would rebuild my life one day at a time. By the second week, the porch was finished. It wasn't perfect. One board sat slightly higher than the others. The fresh white paint didn't exactly match the older railing. But every morning when I stepped outside with my coffee, I looked at it with quiet pride. I'd rebuilt it. And somehow, that felt like a reflection of my own life. Each morning followed the same routine. Before sunrise, I stretched my injured leg. Then I made breakfast for Emma, drove her to Miller Creek Elementary, and returned to the farmhouse with another list of repairs waiting for me. Some days, my leg cooperated. Other days, it reminded me exactly why the Army had medically retired me. I hated asking anyone for help. The Army teaches you to solve problems, not become one. Walter understood that long before I did. One Saturday morning, I heard the sound of pickup trucks pulling into the driveway. Then another, and another. By the time I stepped onto the porch, 6 trucks were parked beside the barn. Men and women climbed out carrying ladders, toolboxes, buckets of paint, and enough lumber to rebuild half the county. I looked at Walter. What is all this? He smiled. I made a few phone calls. One of the men walked toward me wearing a faded Marine Corps cap. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an easy smile. I'm Mike Reynolds. He carefully shook my hand. Walter tells me you're Army. I was, he laughed. Once Army, always Army. Before I could answer, a woman carrying a box of paintbrushes walked over. I'm Susan. My husband served with the 101st years ago. She pointed toward the roof. That roof isn't going to repair itself. Within 30 minutes, the farmhouse looked like a busy construction site. Someone climbed onto the roof. Someone else repaired loose shutters. Others replaced broken fence posts. No one asked for money. No one expected anything in return. They simply came to help. I stood there feeling almost uncomfortable. I can't let all of you do this. Mike looked at me as though I had said something unbelievable. You already did your part. I just drove trucks and managed supplies. He smiled, and those supplies kept people alive. There wasn't much I could say after that.